So, Buddhism and certain Buddhist texts that I've given you. Why these? I'll just say a basic thing about Buddhism. Buddhism grew out of Hinduism the way Christianity grew out of Judaism. The Buddha himself was raised within the Hindu tradition, and when it talks in that little life summary about him encountering holy men, they would have basically been Hindu holy men. The language of reincarnation never really left his discourse. So that's a holdover from Hinduism. The caste system, however, Buddhism doesn't really make time for that. So that's a pretty big difference. Maybe the biggest difference, though, if you that comparison of Hinduism as to Buddhism, as Judaism as to Christianity, is that in the case of Christianity, of course, it ended up being a lot bigger than Judaism. I mean, far more Christians in the world than Jews. Well, there's probably about twice as many Hindus as Buddhists. And that wasn't always the case. For a while, Buddhism sort of dominated the nation of India and was a pretty big deal in the nation of China. Probably around 1000 AD, someone I read said that probably two-thirds of the people on earth were Buddhists. But then Buddhism has very much receded in India itself. It's still a big deal in Southeast Asia. It's still a big deal in China. But at this point, I believe only about 2% of Indians are Buddhists. Though it's still honored, people still go to the shrines there, things like that. And one could argue that it has influenced Hinduism, that Buddhist spirituality has had an influence on Hindu spirituality. But it did not just take over the way Christianity took over from Judaism. And I say that as a Jew, by the way. So anyway, that in itself is an interesting thing. Michael will talk about it a little bit in the video we're going to watch. Why these particular texts as an introduction to Buddhism? The first one, the Herigel text about the earthquake in the restaurant and stuff like that, gives you some kind of sense of what Buddhism can do, how it can transform a person. Okay? And I think that's, when you read it, you'll go, whoa, how does somebody get like this? And that's a good question to ask about that particular religion, or the practices that form that religion. The life of the Buddha, because you need to know how the whole thing began. And this, whether or not this account of his life is entirely accurate, or folklore has played a big part, I'm sure, in the life of the Buddha. But still, this is the story, and it is as central a story for that tradition as the story of the Passion of Christ is for the Christian tradition, or the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt is for the Jewish tradition. The About.com I just thought was sort of a good summary of the basic ideas. And this is a religion that begins in basic ideas more than in a particular faith. The Buddha didn't talk about the supernatural very much, if at all. Maybe reincarnation gets mentioned a few times, but that's about it. And that makes it unusual among those things that we call a religion. So I just thought it was a good summary of the basic doctrines. And then the hardest thing, probably, the part of these readings that you'll probably have the most trouble with, are the edicts of King Ashoka. And I gave those to you because with that guy, something remarkable happened. I mean, you'll hear his whole story about how he came to his faith. But the fact that a king did that a king and a conqueror, but especially someone who has the responsibilities of a king, also ended up becoming basically a pacifist and got away with it, is wild. I don't know of another king that was true of. There was a French king who was made a saint, but I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the history of that guy to know whether he was a pacifist. But King Ashoka managed to stay in power for decades, even though he had this ideology that might have made him very vulnerable to his neighbors. And the other thing with those edicts is you can really hear a person's voice in them. Michael Woodall talk about that too. But you get a glimpse of this man and what he lives by and what he lives for. And so I thought that was sort of powerful. But it's always worth asking, any spiritual tradition, What would the world be like if everybody did this? It's one thing to do stuff in a monastery. What's it like if you do it out in the world? What's it like if you have actual responsibilities? And King Ashok is, in some sense, an interesting answer to those questions.